Okay, so I've been using the blunderbuss over the past probably 4 or 5 months or so, and I want to say it's probably better than the rapier. And I don't mean that lightly either. I think it's objectively better, more damage than the rapier, and even in group content, it is still better than the rapier. Now, I'm saying this as someone who's used the evade rapier even before it became popular. I've been using evade rapier for the better part of pretty much the entire history of this game. For as long as it's been out, I've basically been playing evade riposte rapier. So I have a lot of experience when it comes to using the rapier, and that's why I think that my opinion should hold some weight here. And yeah, I guess I'll just kind of talk about why the blunderbuss is better, and I'll give some examples. I'll go over some damage numbers and all of this stuff. But first, I want to cover what has changed to make the blunderbuss better. So the first big change here is that the rapier was nerfed. And if you don't know from the previous patch notes, omnidirectional evade, the evade perk was reduced from 20% to 14%, which is a pretty significant number. Yeah, I mean, that's just massive. You're basically getting less in power. Now, this isn't a huge problem because you're not as reliant on empower, not only as a rapier player, but just in general. You can pretty much get empower capped without needing this. So this isn't the biggest nerf. This is the biggest nerf. And not many people realize why this is the biggest nerf. But essentially, crescendo reduced from 30% to 25%. What this means is this perk here. Individual successful light attacks reduce the cooldown of this ability by 25%. Now this used to be 30%. So if you hit 3 light attacks, then the cooldown of evade is reduced by 90%. And if you pair that with red curtains, refreshing strikes, and even refreshing move, you only need 2 to 3 light attacks to fully regenerate evade. So it's pretty quick. However, now that it's 25%, you actually need 3 to 4 light attacks, and usually it's 4 in order to refresh evade. This is a huge nerf, and I don't think people realize how big of a nerf this really is, because people only care about the damage numbers. But realistically, if you are an evade rapier player, the whole idea is you want to spam evade into light attacks, and this messes up your timing. You're going to be lowering your overall DPS from just this one change. So it's a pretty significant change. And then the last one is that momentum nerf. This one here is now 25% instead of 30%. So another pretty significant nerf. That's a 5% just flat damage decrease whenever you use evade into a light attack. So yeah, I mean, pretty significant nerfs, I gotta say. And I've tried to use the rapier after the patch. You know, I obviously love this weapon, so I'm still gonna use it. But it's just not as good as it used to be, and that's mainly because of the crescendo nerf. Not the damage. Damage is still nerfed, but the biggest thing is this crescendo nerf. Alright, so now let's go over why the blunderbuss is better. Alright, so I want to start by talking about the buff that the blunderbuss got in the recent patch. Now, apparently this isn't well known, but the blunderbuss received a 12% base damage increase. That is insane. A lot of these ranged weapons got a huge buff in PvE. So the blunderbuss got a 12% damage increase, which is already massive. Not to mention, there was a friend of mine who actually tested the damage before the patch, and the blunderbuss was actually dealing more damage than the rapier even before this buff. And I tend to agree with that. I never tested it personally, but from my experience playing the game, you know, using blunderbuss and using rapier, I tended to deal more damage with the blunderbuss than I did when I used my rapier build. So with that out of the way, let's go over a build that I use, explain kind of the basics of this build, and then we'll go into a few tests that I'll do just to show comparisons on the damage of Blunderbuss versus Rapier. So there's actually a few different ways that you can set up a Blunderbuss build. My personal favorite is going Blunderbuss Inferno because it stacks pretty nicely with fire damage. So you'll be using Inferno for the base damage increase of 15% while within 15 meters, which is pretty much always. You're never really going to be out of that distance. And then you want to use Duneborn Hollow. There is an option that you could use the Hoplite one right here if you wanted to. It's not as important to really get the Duneborn, but the Duneborn is really good because you'll have Refreshing Move, Disdained, and then you can put Flame Attunement on it or whatever you want. And having an attunement is really nice, I've noticed. And if you pair that with something like Fire Harnessing, it will help you a lot. Now, you can see I only have one piece of Fire Harnessing, so it's not like a huge damage increase. I also don't have the Rune Glasses that add extra damage, but this is just a baseline just to get you started, and I'm sure there's some nuances that you can improve on if you wanted to, but overall this should kind of be the general gist that you want to go for. There's two options on armor artifacts. You could either go for the Attuned Leather Pants or the Winged Leather Shoes. Both have merits, but I will say that I think I prefer the Attuned Leather Pants just because you're going to be getting a lot more attribute thresholds. For example, you can pick up 25 dex as well as 300 int and 350 strength, which is going to just increase your damage by a lot. Not to mention, you'll also be able to pick up 25 focus for ability cooldown reduction. So a lot of this kind of makes sense when it comes to this build. And yeah, that's why I prefer the Attuned Leather Pants. But of course, if you wanted to use Winged Leather Shoes and you don't have Attuned Leather Pants, for example, you could do that too. And then for Jewelry Artifact, it's not really important. I mean, you could use Endless Thirst. This is the one I use, but it's not really going to help you that much. But it is an option, I guess. You could also use Elemental Band, and in fact, Elemental Band might be better, just because you'll have Keen Awareness, and I think Blunderbuss definitely will be better when it comes to stacking crit chance. I don't use it though because I like to have extra attributes to use for, so for example, I have 36 int on this instead of having Magnify. And if I had Magnify, it would mess up my stats. But I guess if I replace this and get a crafted earring, it would be the same difference. Anyways, those are your options. Either what is it? Endless Thirst or Elemental Band. Yeah. So Elemental Band is probably the better option here. It's just that I guess I'm stuck with using this just because that's what I'm using. But yeah. And then everything else should just be Enchanted Ward. One perk that you probably want is Leeching Shrapnel Blast. It's going to help you a little bit with sustain. It's definitely not, going to make or break your build. If you don't have it, it's fine, but it does help a little bit, especially in situations where you really, really need health. It will make a difference. So that is one build. Another option is you can go for a lightning build. This is one of my personal favorites that I use definitely in ancient dungeons. So for example, Lazarus, Starstone, Ennead. Anywhere where there's ancient enemies, it's really good because you'll have a damage increase against ancient enemies with lightning damage. If you don't know that, that's how it works. And yeah, if you just use Mjolnir as your secondary, you'll be dealing 20% extra lightning damage. And if you pair that with a lightning damage ring, it goes a long ways. So that's another option. You can also run Electrified Rune Glass in your armor for extra damage. So there's a few different ways that you can set up the build. That's all I'm saying. But the key idea here is the abilities that I'll go over next. So this is my personal setup for the blunderbuss. I really like Claw Shot, and I'll explain why I really like this ability as we go along. But the things you definitely need are Shrapnel Blast and Splitting Grenades. Those are the two requirements. Claw Shot you don't necessarily need, but it really just... I'm going to explain why I love this ability so much. Alternatively, if you don't want to use Claw Shot, you can use Blast Shot. This will allow you to CC enemies and also apply a rend. So this one is also a pretty decent option. It helps in clumps as well. But this is what Splitting Grenades is for. So Splitting Grenades are really good in clumps, and then these two are just, you know, high damage single target. So here's why I really like Claw Shot. Firstly, you can use it very often just because your cooldowns are going to be coming off very quickly. A lot of these are low cooldowns. Blast Shot is 23 seconds, and same as Splitting Grenades, so it helps to have something with a little bit of a shorter cooldown in here, just what I've noticed. And not only that, but probably the best perk here, which is Mobile Overload, which allows you to gain 1 extra shot every time you use Claw Shot. And you're going to be using Claw Shot a lot, so every time you use a Claw Shot, you're going to gain an extra bullet in your chamber, which means you won't have to reload as often, and you'll be dealing more overall DPS. And also, landing a pellet, even if it's blocked, lowers the cooldown of this ability by 2%. So this is why you can use Claw Shot very often, because every single pellet is going to decrease Claw Shot's cooldown by 2%, and when you consider that Blunderbuss shoots 6 pellets at a time, you know, that's just going to stack very quickly. So yeah, you also gain stamina, which is definitely nice, but it's not, you know, make or break. So anyways, that is why I have this set up the way I do. And now let's go over some comparisons on the blunderbuss and the rapier and really show why this weapon is higher damage than the rapier. Alright, so both of those tests I ran with my standard builds, with 300 int, 350 dex for my rapier build. Now, bear in mind that this rapier has Rogue, Refreshing Move, and Flame Attunement. So it has Rogue on it. In the next test, I'm going to be testing raw backstabs. So it should be a better representation of specifically this rapier on how well it can perform. And in my opinion, this is probably the best optimal rape that you can get for evade rapier when it comes to doing backstabs. So this should be a better representation. Now for my blunderbuss build, I was using 350 strength, 25 dex, 300 int, 25 focus, and 24 con. So those were my attributes for these two tests. Now let's get right into the next test. All right, so that was the test. I did struggle a bit to maintain tracking with the rapier, but even so, that just goes to show how easy the blunderbuss is to use compared to the rapier. I don't think the tracking issue is going to be the same against regular PvE enemies. So the next test we're going to be doing is that, but regardless, I still think this test very clearly shows the big difference between the rapier and the blunderbuss in terms of raw DPS. And the blunderbuss very clearly outperforms the rapier. Alright, so that was the test. Now, the last one was a little scuffed, but it still should convey the same point, which is that the blunderbuss does deal more damage. That was with a single tank who was a little new as a tank, but, you know, it's the same idea. Blunderbuss just deals more damage. And I want to make something clear, by the way. I use very strong builds for both of these. So my rapier build has a crafted rapier with rogue, refreshing move, and flame attunement. As well as Inferno on both of these to get the extra 15% damage. We also use the same ring, which is a leeching thrust damage hardy ring. The only difference really is that we use wing leather shoes on the rapier and attuned leather pants on the blunderbuss. And the reason is we always have haste with rapier thanks to swiftness. So that is the video. I guess if you enjoyed, leave a like. If you have any questions or anything you want to mention, leave a comment below and I'll try to get back to them. Anyways, thanks for watching and I'll see you guys in the next one.